My husband forced Maine to donate blood to his mistress while pregnant. He regretted it when I left. In the heart of a bustling city, Mei Lin was a 26-year-old woman who thought her life was finally falling into place. She was 6 months pregnant, glowing with the excitement of welcoming her first child, and married to Kai Wu, a man she believed was her partner in life. But 2018 was the year that shattered her world. It started with the small things: late-night meetings that didn't add up, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers, and the distant tone in Kai's voice. Maya brushed it aside, convincing herself that stress and work were to blame. But then, she saw the message, a name that would forever haunt her: Lena Fang. Lena was everything Mei wasn't: young, glamorous, and bold. She was a socialite with a knack for drawing attention, and apparently she had drawn Kai's as well. When Mei confronted him, her voice trembling with disbelief, she didn't find remorse or shame in his eyes. Instead, she was met with a coldness that froze her to the core. "She needs you," Kai said one night, his words piercing Mei like daggers. Lena was in critical condition, and her pregnancy was at risk. And Mei? She was a match for the blood transfusion Lena desperately needed. Mei begged him to reconsider. "I'm pregnant. How can you ask this of me?" But Kai's response was chillingly indifferent. "This isn't about you, Mei." Torn between her own health and the life of an innocent child, Mei agreed. She sat in the sterile hospital room, tears streaming down her face as the nurse drew her blood. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional weight crushing her. That night, her body couldn't take the strain. Racked with pain, she miscarried. Alone in the dark, Mei wept for the child she would never meet. And where was Kai? By Lena's side, comforting her, oblivious to the devastation he had left behind. Mei had lost everything: her baby, her marriage, and her trust in the world. But what she didn't know was that this was the beginning of a journey that would transform her into a force neither Kai nor Lena could ever have anticipated. Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Mei's world shattered. Mei Lin didn't grow up imagining a fairy tale romance, but she believed in the power of love and partnership. When she met Kai Wu, a man who seemed driven, confident, and kind, it felt like the start of something solid. He wasn't overly romantic, but he was reliable, and Mei thought that was enough. Their wedding was a simple but joyful affair. Friends and family toasted their future, and for the first couple of years things seemed to fall into place. Mei worked as a graphic designer, quietly pursuing her passion for art, while Kai threw himself into building his business empire. They didn't have extravagant vacations or flashy displays of wealth, but Mei didn't care. She thought they were building a future together, a family. Then came the day she told Kai she was pregnant. It had been a quiet Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through their modest apartment windows. Mei had woken up early, holding the positive test in her trembling hands. She imagined his joy, his excitement. But when she told him, his response was strangely muted. He smiled and said the right words: "That's wonderful news, Mei," but something in his tone felt off. At the time, she brushed it aside. He's just surprised, she told herself. And for a while things seemed okay. Kai was attentive enough, even making an effort to join her for doctor's appointments. But then, little by little, the distance began to creep in. Kai started working late, really late. At first, Mei didn't think much of it. After all, his business was growing, and she didn't want to be the kind of wife who demanded constant attention. She focused on her art projects, her growing baby bump, and the quiet moments she had to herself. But soon, his absences became harder to ignore. One evening, she decided to surprise him at the office. She packed a homemade dinner. Kai loved her sesame noodles and headed over. But when she got there, the receptionist gave her an odd look. "Mr. Wu left hours ago," she said, not bothering to hide her confusion. Mei smiled politely, though her stomach churned. Maybe he went to a meeting, she thought, trying to reassure herself. But as she sat in the car, waiting and watching, her mind raced with questions. Where was he? And why hadn't he told her? Weeks passed, and Kai's excuses grew thinner. His phone was glued to his hand, his text notifications silenced. Mei started noticing things: a faint whiff of perfume that wasn't hers, receipts for fancy dinners she hadn't attended, and the way he avoided her eyes when she asked about his day. Then came the message. It was an ordinary evening. Kai had left his phone on the counter, something he rarely did anymore. It buzzed once, then again. Mei hesitated. She hated the idea of snooping, but something inside her wouldn't let it go. She picked up the phone and saw the name Lena Fang. Her hands shook as she opened the message. It wasn't just one, it was a string of texts. Flirty, intimate, full of inside jokes that cut Mei like a knife. She couldn't breathe. Her world tilted, and in that moment, everything she thought she knew crumbled. When Kai came home that night, Mei confronted him. She expected him to deny it, to scramble for an excuse. Instead, he looked at her with a cold detachment that sent shivers down her spine. "Lena means nothing," he said flatly. "She's just someone I see from time to time. Don't blow this out of proportion." Out of proportion? Mei's voice cracked. "I'm your wife. I'm carrying your child. How could you?" But Kai didn't let her finish. "You knew I was ambitious when you married me, Mei. I don't have time for your emotional games." In the days that followed, May I tried to make sense of it all. She wanted to believe him, to think that maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But deep down, she knew better. Lena wasn't just some passing fling. And worse, Kai didn't seem to care about the damage he was causing. The tipping point came on that rainy evening. When Kai told May they had to rush to the hospital, she assumed it was for an emergency related to his work. But when he explained that it was Lena who needed help, that she was pregnant and in critical condition, May felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. "You can't be serious," she said, clutching her stomach. "You're asking me to risk myself for her?" Kai didn't flinch. "She's carrying a child, May. A life. We can't just let her die. She's your mistress," May screamed, her voice breaking. But Kai's expression was unreadable, his jaw set. May thought about refusing, about standing her ground. But then she thought of the baby, Lena's baby. An innocent life, caught in the middle of this twisted nightmare. Against every instinct, against her better judgment, May went to the hospital. The blood donation felt like an eternity. As the nurse inserted the needle, May stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing something, a piece of herself, maybe. Or something more. When it was over, May was weak and lightheaded. She barely made it home before the pain started. It was sharp, relentless, and terrifying. She collapsed in the hallway, clutching her stomach, screaming for help. But no one came. Hours later, in the sterile light of a hospital room, May learned the truth. She had lost the baby. Her baby. The child she had dreamed of, the life she had hoped for. Gone. And where was Kai? With Lena, of course. May spent the next few days in a fog of grief. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of their apartment, staring out at the rain, her hands resting on the emptiness of her stomach. She felt hollow, like a shell of the person she used to be. When Kai finally came home, he didn't even acknowledge what had happened. "Lena's stable now," he said, as if that was supposed to comfort her. May didn't respond. She couldn't. Something inside her had broken, something that couldn't be fixed. That night, as Kai slept in the guest room, May made a decision. She couldn't stay. Not in this apartment. Not in this marriage. Not in this life. She packed a bag, her hands trembling but determined. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing for sure. She was never coming back. The escape from despair. When May walked out of her apartment that night, a part of her still felt like she might turn back. Her hands clutched a small suitcase, filled with only the bare essentials: clothes, a photo album, and the last sketch she'd made before her world fell apart. She left behind everything else: her home, her dreams, and the life she had once believed in. The streets were quiet, the city lights casting long shadows across the pavement. May walked for what felt like hours, her mind racing, but her body moving on autopilot. Each step felt heavy, like she was dragging the weight of her shattered heart with her. But there was also a spark, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in weeks, the faintest hope of freedom. May's first stop was the train station. She bought a ticket to the farthest destination she could afford, a small coastal town she'd only heard of in passing. The idea of disappearing, of starting over in a place where no one knew her name, felt both terrifying and strangely comforting. As the train rumbled through the night, May stared out the window, watching the city fade into the distance. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not the quiet, restrained tears she had shed in her apartment, but a flood of raw emotion. It wasn't just grief for her lost child or her broken marriage. It was grief for the person she used to be, the version of herself that had trusted too easily and loved too deeply. The town May arrived in was nothing like the city she had left behind. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the ocean, and the streets were lined with quaint shops and cottages. It felt like stepping into another world, a world that didn't yet know her pain. For the first few days, May stayed in a small inn, spending her time wandering the town and trying to figure out her next move. She had
One
little
afternoon,
money
as May
and no
sat
clear
on a
plan,
bench overlooking the
but
sea,
she had
she
something
met
more
Lijen,
important: the
He was
determination
an older
to
man.
survive. Perhaps in his late 40s, with a calm, confident presence. He noticed the sketchbook resting on her lap and asked to see her work. At first, May hesitated. Her art had always been personal, a reflection of her inner world. But something about Lijen's kind smile put her at ease. "These are remarkable," he said, flipping through the pages. "You have real talent." Mai blushed, unsure how to respond. "It's just a hobby," she murmured. Lijen raised an eyebrow. "A hobby doesn't capture emotion like this. Have you ever thought about pursuing it professionally?" The question caught May off guard. Pursuing her art professionally had been a dream she'd long since buried under the demands of her marriage. She shook her head, feeling a pang of regret. I wouldn't even know where to start. Li Zhen studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes, starting over is the best thing we can do, he said. If you're willing to take a chance, I'd like to help you. Li Zhen wasn't just a kind stranger. He was a successful businessman who had built an empire from the ground up. But unlike Kai, he didn't carry the arrogance of his wealth. Instead, he radiated a quiet confidence, a belief in hard work and second chances. Over the next few weeks, he became Mia's mentor, and in many ways her lifeline. At first, Mia was reluctant to accept his help. She was used to being independent, even when it hurt. But Li Zhen had a way of making her feel seen, as though he understood the pain she carried without her having to explain it. He offered her a position at one of his smaller businesses, not out of pity, but because he believed in her potential. Working for Li Zhen was a challenge Mei hadn't expected. She was thrown into a world of deadlines, negotiations, and business strategies she didn't fully understand. But with each passing day, she found herself growing stronger. She learned to navigate the complexities of the business world, to assert herself in meetings, and to make decisions with confidence. It wasn't just about the job. It was about reclaiming her sense of self. For the first time in years, Mia felt like she was building something of her own, something no one could take away from her. As she settled into her new life, Mei decided to adopt a new name, Ningjiu. It wasn't just a name. It was a statement. Ningjiu was a woman who didn't look back, and who didn't let her past define her. She was strong, capable, and determined to move forward. But letting go of the past wasn't easy. There were nights when Mei, or Ning, as she now called herself, lay awake, haunted by memories of her lost child, and the life she had left behind. She wondered if she had made the right choice, if she was strong enough to keep going. But every morning she rose with renewed resolve, telling herself that she didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to keep moving. One day, as Ning stood in her small apartment, surrounded by sketches and business reports, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the timid, heartbroken Mei Lin. In her place stood someone new, someone who had fought to survive, and was slowly learning to thrive. It wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a life she was determined to make her own. Rebuilding strength. Ningjiu, as Mei now called herself, had spent the first weeks in her new role cautiously navigating a world she didn't fully understand. It wasn't just about learning the ropes of business, it was about proving to herself that she could succeed. For someone who had been made to feel small for so long, every small victory felt like a rebellion against her past. Her mentor, Li Zhen, didn't coddle her. He believed in tough love, offering guidance when needed but expecting Ning to figure things out on her own. "You'll make mistakes," he told her during one of their meetings. "The important thing is how you fix them." And mistakes did come, many of them. In her first week, Ning accidentally forwarded an incomplete proposal to a client. The embarrassment was crushing, but she swallowed her pride, apologized, and stayed up all night reworking the document. The client was impressed by her persistence, and Ning began to realize something important: failure wasn't the end. It was just another step. As the months passed, Ning grew more confident in her role. She started attending meetings with Li Zhen, sitting quietly at first, then slowly finding her voice. At one particularly tense negotiation, she surprised even herself by speaking up with a suggestion that shifted the entire conversation. When the deal closed successfully, Li Zhen gave her a rare smile of approval. "You've got the instincts," he said. "Now you just need to trust them." Those words stayed with Ning. Trusting herself had always been the hardest part. For years, she had let others dictate her choices, convincing herself that their judgment mattered more than her own. But now, in this new chapter of her life, she was learning to listen to that quiet voice inside, the one that told her she was capable, even when doubts crept in. Outside of work, Ning began to find small joys again. She rediscovered her love for sketching, spending quiet evenings with a pencil in hand, letting her thoughts flow onto the page. Her art became a kind of therapy, a way to process the emotions she had buried deep within. One evening, while sketching a scene of crashing waves, she realized something: her art had changed. It wasn't just about beauty anymore. It carried a rawness, a depth that reflected her struggles and her growth. She decided to share one of her sketches with Li Zhen, who stared at it for a long moment before saying, "This belongs in a gallery." She laughed, thinking he was joking. But Li Zhen wasn't one to make empty statements. He connected her with an art curator he knew, and within weeks one of Ning's pieces was displayed in a small local exhibition. Standing in front of her work at the gallery, Ning felt a spark of pride she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about recognition, it was about reclaiming a part of herself that she thought had been lost forever. But even as Ning began to rebuild her life, the shadows of her past lingered. At night she would lie awake, haunted by memories of her child, of Kai's betrayal, of the life she had left behind. There were moments when its weight felt unbearable. But each time she reminded herself of how far she had come. "You're not that person anymore," she whispered to herself. "You're stronger now." One particularly difficult night she opened her journal and wrote down everything she felt: her anger, her sadness, her longing for justice. As the words spilled onto the page, she realized something: she didn't just want to survive. She wanted to thrive. She wanted to take back the power that had been stolen from her, and use it to build a life she could be proud of. Li Zhen noticed the change in her. One morning after a successful presentation, he pulled her aside. "You've come a long way," he said. "But I have a feeling you're just getting started." His words planted a seed in Ning's mind. She began to think about her future, not just as an employee in Li Zhen's business but as someone who could create something of her own. She started taking on more responsibilities, diving deeper into the intricacies of business strategy. She read books, attended workshops, and sought advice from anyone willing to share their knowledge. Over time, Ning's transformation became undeniable. She was no longer the timid woman who had arrived in the coastal town with nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. She was a force to be reckoned with, intelligent, determined, and unafraid to take risks. One day, while reviewing a new project proposal, Ning caught a glaring error that could have cost the company thousands. When she brought it up during a meeting, she expected pushback. Instead, her colleagues listened, nodding in agreement. It was a small moment, but it marked a turning point. Ning wasn't just finding her place, she was carving it out. Yet through it all, Ning kept her past a closely guarded secret. She didn't talk about Kai, or Lena, or the child she had lost. It wasn't that she wanted to forget, she knew that was impossible. But she wasn't ready to let anyone in, not yet. She needed to heal on her own terms, in her own time. Still, there were moments when her old life crept back in. One afternoon, while scrolling through social media, she stumbled across a photo of Kai and Lena at a charity gala. They looked every bit the perfect couple, smiling for the cameras, their lives seemingly untouched by the devastation they had caused. Ning's hands trembled as she stared at the image, her mind flooding with memories. But instead of anger, she felt something else: determination. They hadn't broken her. They hadn't won. And they never would. As Ning closed her laptop, she took a deep breath and looked around her small but cozy apartment. She thought about how far she had come, about the woman she was becoming. She wasn't there yet, not entirely. But she was closer than she had ever been. For the first time in a long time, Ning allowed herself to dream. Not about the past, or what could have been, but about the future, her future. And she knew one thing for certain: it was going to be hers. A new ally. 3 years after leaving her old life behind, Ning Zhuyu stood at the cusp of something greater. Her work with Li Zhen had grown from small projects to managing entire ventures, and her confidence matched her competence. She had found her voice in the boardroom, and wielded it with precision. Yet she remained cautious about those around her, guarding her heart like a fortress. She had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford to give freely. But sometimes, life has a way of surprising even the most guarded hearts. It all started with a joint venture between Li Zhen's company and another corporate giant. The negotiations required Ning to work closely with Junyi, the CEO of the partnering firm. From the moment they met, Ning felt the tension between them. Junyi was sharp, cold, and undeniably arrogant. He wasn't just confident, he was the kind of man who assumed the world would bend to his will. During their first meeting, his tone clipped. "If this partnership is going to work, I need competence, not excuses." Ning raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She had dealt with men like Junyi before, men who underestimated her because she didn't fit their idea of what power looked like. She wasn't about to let him rattle her. Instead, she responded with calm professionalism, countering his sharpness with steady resolve. Their interactions were a constant push and pull. Junyi questioned everything Ning proposed, challenging her decisions and dissecting her strategies. At first it felt like a personal attack. But over time, Ning realized something else: Junyi wasn't trying to undermine her. He was testing her. "Hai Singher. And Ning rose to the challenge. During one particularly heated meeting, Ning stood her ground against Junyi's objections, backing her arguments with data and a clear vision for the project. When she finished, the room fell silent. For a moment, Junyi just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally he nodded. "Not bad," he said, almost grudgingly. It wasn't exactly praise, but it was enough to spark a shift in their dynamic. Over the weeks that followed, Junyi began to see Ning in a new light. He admired her intelligence, her resilience, and her ability to remain composed under pressure. She wasn't like anyone he had worked with before, and that intrigued him. At the same time, Ning noticed that beneath Junyi's icy exterior was a man who valued loyalty and integrity, qualities she hadn't expected to find in someone so seemingly ruthless. But trust didn't come easily for Ning. She had built walls around her heart, and she wasn't about to tear them down just because Junyi had shown her a glimpse of his humanity. Still, their partnership grew stronger, marked by mutual respect and a surprising camaraderie. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, Junyi invited Ning to dinner. She hesitated, wary of mixing business with anything that felt remotely personal. But curiosity got the better of her, and she agreed. Over the course of the meal, Ning saw a different side of Junyi. He shared stories of his early struggles, of building his company from the ground up, and of the sacrifices he had made along the way. It was the first time Ning saw him as more than just a cold, calculating CEO. He was human, flawed, ambitious, and driven by a need to prove himself. "I know what it's like to start over," Junyi said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "People don't see that when they look at me now, but I've been where you are, fighting to survive. Fighting to matter." Ning didn't respond immediately. She wasn't ready to open up about her own past, but she appreciated his honesty. For the first time she wondered if Junyi could become more than just an ally. As their partnership deepened, Junyi became increasingly curious about Ning's story. He had pieced together fragments, a sense that she had endured more than she let on, that her strength came from surviving something profound. But Ning remained elusive, deflecting his questions with practiced ease. "Everyone has a past," she told him one day, her tone light but firm. "Some of us just choose to leave it behind." Junyi didn't press further, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Ning was carrying more than she let on. And while he respected her privacy, he couldn't deny his growing admiration for her. It wasn't just her intelligence or her resilience, it was the way she carried herself, with quiet strength and unshakable determination. Their relationship wasn't without its challenges. There were moments when their differences clashed, when Junyi's arrogance grated on Ning's nerves, or when Ning's guarded nature frustrated Junyi. But those moments only seemed to strengthen their bond. They learned to navigate each other's complexities, finding a balance that made their partnership not just effective, but unexpectedly rewarding. And yet Ning couldn't ignore the questions that lingered in the back of her mind. Could she trust Junyi? Could she let him in, even just a little? Or would letting down her guard only lead to more pain? One day as they worked late on a critical proposal, Junyi broke the silence. "You know, Ning," he said, his tone uncharacteristically soft, "you're one of the most impressive people I've ever met. But I can't help wondering what drives you? What keeps you pushing forward?" Ning paused, her pen hovering over the page. She didn't look at him as she answered, her voice steady but distant. "Sometimes the only way to move on is to keep going. You don't stop to think, you don't stop to feel, you just move." Junyi nodded, sensing the weight behind her words. He didn't push for more, but in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just respect anymore. It was understanding. For the first time in years, Ning found herself wondering if it was possible to let someone in. To trust, even just a little. But the thought scared her. She wasn't sure she was ready. Not yet. And so she kept moving, kept building, kept fighting. Because if there was one thing Ning Zhiyu knew for certain, it was this: she had survived too much to ever let her guard down completely. Not until she was sure. Not until she was ready. A plan for justice. For 3 years, Ning Zhiyu had worked tirelessly to rebuild her life. She had found strength, independence, and a sense of purpose she never thought possible. But no matter how much she accomplished, the ghosts of her past lingered, whispering in the quiet hours of the night. She had buried the pain of her miscarriage, the humiliation of Kai's betrayal, and the injustice of being cast aside. But burying something doesn't make it go away. It festers, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. That moment came when Ning stumbled upon a crucial piece of information, one that would change everything. It happened by chance. During a meeting with a prospective client, Ning was handed a portfolio of their previous work. She flipped through the pages, scanning contracts and partnership histories, when a familiar name caught her eye: Lena Fang. Her breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. Lena was listed as a co-founder of the client's company, a name Ning hadn't heard in years but could never forget. She read further, piecing together a story she hadn't expected. Lena's rise to prominence wasn't as organic as it appeared. The portfolio hinted at shady dealings, falsified documents, and unethical partnerships. Ning's hands trembled as she set the file down. She had spent years trying to forget Kai and Lena, but now it was as if fate had placed this information directly in her path. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel fear or sadness. She felt purpose. That evening, Ning sat in her apartment, the portfolio spread out on the table before her. She combed through the details, highlighting inconsistencies and tracing connections. Lena's success, it seemed, had been built on a web of lies. And Ning suspected that Kai wasn't just aware of it, he had helped orchestrate it. The realization ignited something deep within her. She had tried to move on, to let the past stay in the past. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about justice for herself, for her lost child, and for anyone else who had been hurt by Kai and Lena's schemes. Ning knew she couldn't do it alone. She reached out to Lai Zhen, who listened intently as she laid out her findings. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I knew there was more to your story," he said finally. "But I didn't expect this." Ning nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I can't let them get away with it." Lai Zhen studied her for a moment before responding. "If this is what you want, I'll support you. But you need to be smart about this. Kai and Lena are powerful, and they won't go down without a fight." Together they began to devise a plan. Lai Zhen used his network to dig deeper into Lena and Kai's dealings, while Ning focused on gathering evidence and building alliances. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about dismantling the empire they had built on lies. One of the first steps in Ning's plan was to expose Lena's fraudulent business practices. Through Lai Zhen's contacts, she connected with a journalist who specialized in uncovering corruption. They worked together to compile a dossier of evidence, including forged contracts, insider testimonies, and financial discrepancies that painted a damning picture of Lena's operations. The journalist promised to run the story, but Ning knew that exposing Lena wasn't enough. She needed to target Kai as well. That's where Junyi came in. Ning hadn't planned on involving Junyi, but she quickly realized that his resources and connections could be invaluable. When she approached him with her findings, he listened carefully, his expression unreadable. "You've been through a lot," he said when she finished, "and you've clearly put a lot of thought into this. But are you sure you're ready for what this could mean?" Ning met his gaze, her voice steady. "I've spent years rebuilding my life. I'm not afraid of them anymore." Junyi nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Then let's do this." With Junyi's help, Ning began to target Kai's business dealings. They uncovered evidence of tax evasion, unethical labor practices, and backroom deals that had allowed his company to flourish at the expense of others. Bit by bit, they began to unravel the empire he had built, exposing its rotten foundation. As Ning's plan unfolded, she started to see cracks in Kai and Lena's seemingly perfect facade. Lena, once the darling of the business world, began to face public scrutiny as the journalist's story gained traction. Investors pulled out of her projects, and her reputation crumbled. Kai, meanwhile, found himself embroiled in legal battles and financial turmoil. For years, he had operated with impunity, confident that his wealth and influence would protect him. But now, he was cornered, his empire on the verge of collapse. But Ning wasn't done. She had one final move to make: a public confrontation that would force Kai and Lena to face the consequences of their actions. She arranged for a charity gala, an event that would be attended by some of the most influential figures in the business world. It was the perfect stage for what she had planned. As the night of the gala approached, Ning felt a mix of nerves and determination. She wasn't the same woman who had been forced to her knees by Kai's betrayal. She was stronger now, and she was ready to take back her power. The gala was a glittering affair, filled with music, laughter, and the clink of champagne glasses. Ning entered the room with her head held high, her confidence radiating like a beacon. She spotted Kai and Lena across the room, their smiles as practiced as ever. When the moment came, Ning stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice steady and clear. She started with a simple statement: the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. She then laid out the evidence, piece by piece, exposing Lena's fraud and Kai's complicity for all to see. The audience murmured in shock, their eyes darting between Ning and the disgraced couple. By the time she finished, there was no doubt about who they were or what they had done. Lena was arrested that night and escorted out of the gala in handcuffs. Kai, though not immediately detained, faced an onslaught of legal challenges that would strip him of his wealth and reputation. For the first time, Ning saw fear in his eyes, the same fear she had felt when he had abandoned her. And for the first time she felt free. The ultimate confrontation. The gala was over, but its aftermath rippled through the world of business and beyond. Lena's arrest was splashed across headlines the next morning, her glamorous image replaced by mugshots and news of fraud allegations. Kai, once untouchable, found himself scrambling to contain the fallout. But for Ning Juyu, this was only the beginning. The confrontation at the gala had been carefully orchestrated, a culmination of months of planning. But there was one piece still missing, one final truth Ning needed to uncover before she could fully move on. As the legal battles unfolded, Ning dug deeper into Kai and Lena's past. Her determination wasn't just about exposing their misdeeds, it was about understanding how they had managed to destroy so much of her life. Through Lai Zhen's connections and Junyi's resources, Ning discovered something that shook her to her core. Lena's betrayal hadn't been a coincidence. It had been deliberate. Hidden in a trail of emails and financial records was evidence that Lena had targeted Kai long before their affair began. She had studied him, learned his weaknesses, and positioned herself to exploit them. And Kai, he had been complicit, willingly sacrificing Mei and their unborn child to protect his public image and advance his career. For days, Ning wrestled with the weight of this discovery. She had always suspected that Kai's betrayal ran deeper than infidelity, but seeing the proof laid out before her was like reopening an old wound. The pain was sharp, but it came with a new resolve. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, she was fighting for herself, for the woman she had been before Kai and Lena had torn her apart. With this new information, Ning decided to confront Kai directly. She arranged to meet him at his office, knowing it would be the last place he'd expect her to show up. When she walked into the sleek, cold space, Kai looked up in surprise, his polished facade slipping for just a moment. "Ning," he said, regaining his composure. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Ning didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed a folder on his desk, filled with the evidence she had uncovered. Kai's smile faltered as he opened it, his eyes scanning the damning documents. For the first time, Ning saw fear flicker in his gaze. "I trusted you," Ning said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I believed in you. And you destroyed everything. For what? For her." Kai tried to speak, but Ning cut him off. "I lost everything because of you, my child, my future, and you didn't even care." For a moment Kai seemed to struggle for words, but all he could manage was a weak excuse. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ning shook her head, her anger bubbling to the surface. "No, Kai. It wasn't supposed to happen at all. You made a choice to betray me, to abandon me, to protect your own selfish ambitions. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Kai's shoulders slumped as the weight of her words sank in. He knew there was no escaping what was coming. Ning had made sure of that. As Ning walked out of his office, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. She had faced Kai, not as the broken woman he had left behind, but as the strong, determined person she had become. And in that moment she realized something: she didn't need his remorse. She didn't need his apology. She had reclaimed her power, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Lena's trial became a media sensation. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her once loyal supporters quickly distanced themselves. Ning followed the proceedings closely, not out of spite but because it was a reminder that justice, while slow, could still prevail. During the trial, more details about Lena's schemes came to light. Witnesses testified about her manipulation, her deceit, and the lengths she had gone to in order to secure her position. It was clear that Lena had built her empire on lies, and now it was crumbling around her. When the verdict was announced guilty on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, Ning felt a sense of relief. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about accountability. For the first time in years, the scales felt balanced. Kai, on the other hand, faced a different kind of reckoning. With his reputation in tatters and his finances in ruins, he found himself abandoned by the very people he had once prioritized over Ning. The empire he had built at her expense was gone, leaving him with nothing but regret. But Ning didn't waste time thinking about Kai or Lena. They were no longer the center of her world. Instead, she focused on the life she had built, the business she was growing, the art she was creating, and the future she was carving out for herself. One evening, as Ning sat in her apartment, sketching a new design for an upcoming exhibition, she received a call from Jun Ye. He had just returned from a business trip and wanted to meet. They had grown closer over the past few months, their partnership deepening into something more personal. Jun Ye had become a steady presence in her life, someone who saw her not as a victim, but as the strong, resilient woman she had become. When they met for dinner, Jun Ye brought up the trial. "It's over now," he said. "You've done what you set out to do." Ning nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's over," she agreed. "But it's also just the beginning." Jun Ye smiled, raising his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. "To new beginnings," Ning echoed, clinking her glass against his. As Ning walked home that night, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time she felt ready to embrace it. She had faced her past, fought for her future, and found a strength within herself she never knew existed. And while the scars of her journey would always remain, they no longer defined her. They were a testament to her resilience, a reminder that she had survived, grown, and thrived. Ning Zhuyu was no longer the woman Kai and Lena had tried to destroy. She was something more, something unbreakable. And she was just getting started. Revelations and reunions. With Lena imprisoned and Kai's empire in ruins, Ning Zhu thought her past was finally behind her. But life had one more surprise in store, something she never could have imagined. It started with a simple phone call. Ning was at her office, reviewing a proposal for a new project, when her assistant walked in, holding the phone with an urgent expression. "There's someone asking for you," the assistant said. She wouldn't give her name, but she says it's important. Ning hesitated before taking the call. "This is Ning Zhu," she said, her voice calm but cautious. There was a pause on the other end of the line before a trembling voice replied, I think I'm your sister." Ning froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She gripped the phone tightly, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. "My sister," she repeated, barely above a whisper. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Yu Zhiyu, an artist from a nearby city. She explained that she had recently discovered adoption records indicating that she had a twin sister. "I've been searching for you," Yu Zhiyu said. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever find you. But then I saw your name in an article about the gala." Ning's mind raced. She had always known she was adopted, but she had never considered the possibility of a sibling, let alone a twin. "I don't know what to say," Ning admitted, her voice cracking with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Yu Zhiyu replied gently. "But if you're willing, I'd like to meet." The days leading up to their meeting were a whirlwind of emotions for Ning. She wasn't sure what to expect or how she would feel. Part of her was excited, but another part was terrified. What if this was some kind of mistake? What if she couldn't handle opening up another chapter of her past? When the day arrived, Ning found herself sitting in a quiet cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea to steady her nerves. She looked up every time the door opened, her heart leaping with anticipation. Finally, Yu Zhu walked in. She was slightly shorter than Ning, with the same almond-shaped eyes and soft features. For a moment they simply stared at each other, the weight of the moment too overwhelming for words. "You really are my sister," Yu Zhu said, her voice filled with wonder. "And you're mine," Ning replied, her lips curving into a small, hesitant smile. Over the next few hours, the sisters talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their struggles. Yu Zhu revealed that she had grown up in a loving but modest home, always feeling like a piece of her life was missing. "I never understood why," she said, "until I found out about you." Ning shared parts of her story, though she kept some details guarded. She wasn't ready to tell Yu Zhu everything, not yet. But she found comfort in their connection, in the way Yu Xiu's presence felt like a missing piece of her own puzzle. As they said their goodbyes that evening, Yu Xiu reached out and squeezed Ning's hand. "I hope we can keep in touch," she said softly. "We will," Ning promised. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of family, a bond that wasn't tied to betrayal or loss, but to hope. Their relationship grew slowly, but steadily over the months that followed. Yu Xiu introduced Ning to her art studio, where she painted vibrant, emotional pieces that told stories of resilience and beauty. Ning found herself drawn to Yu Xiu's work, seeing echoes of her own journey in the strokes of her sister's brush. One day, while browsing Yu Xiu's paintings, Ning came across a piece that stopped her in her tracks. It was a depiction of two young girls, standing hand in hand, surrounded by a glowing light. "This is us," Yu Xiu said, stepping beside her. "What we could have been." Tears welled in Ning's eyes as she stared at the painting. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's not just a painting," Yu Xiu replied. "It's a reminder that even when we were apart, we were always connected." As Ning and Yu Xiu's bond deepened, Ning began to share more about her past. She told her sister about Kai Lena and the pain she had endured. Yu Xiu listened without judgment, her eyes filled with empathy. "You've been through so much," she said. "But you're still here. That's strength." Yu Xiu's support gave Ning the courage to take the next step in her journey. She decided to host an art exhibition featuring both her own work and Yu Xiu's, a celebration of their reunion and their shared resilience. The night of the exhibition was a triumph. The gallery was filled with people admiring the sisters' art, their stories woven into every piece. Ning and Yu Xiu stood side by side, their smiles reflecting the strength and hope that had brought them together. During her speech, Ning spoke about the power of connection and the importance of embracing both the pain and the beauty of life. "This is not just a celebration of art," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's a celebration of second chances, of finding strength in the most unexpected places." As the audience applauded, Ning glanced at Yu Xiu, who gave her a reassuring nod. For the first time, Ning felt like she had truly come full circle. She had faced her past, found her family, and discovered a sense of purpose that went beyond herself. As the night drew to a close, Ning stood outside the gallery, looking up at the stars. Yu Xiu joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "What's next for you?" her sister asked. Ning smiled, her gaze fixed on the endless sky. "Anything I want," she said. "The past doesn't define me anymore. The future is mine to create." Yu Xiu squeezed her shoulder. "Then, let's create it together." New beginnings. For Ning Xiu, life had come full circle. She had fought battles she never imagined, endured pain that once seemed insurmountable, and risen from the ashes of her past stronger than ever. But as she stood at the edge of a new chapter, she knew one thing for certain: her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. What? The art exhibition she had organized with her sister, Yu Xiu, had been a resounding success. People from all walks of life had come to admire their work, to hear their stories, and to celebrate the resilience they both embodied. The experience left Ning feeling something she hadn't felt in years: inspired. The days that followed were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Ning received invitations to collaborate with galleries, mentorship offers from business leaders, and even inquiries from aspiring artists who looked up to her. Each new opportunity felt like a reminder that her hard work and determination had paid off. But what mattered most to Ning wasn't the recognition or the accolades. It was the feeling of knowing she had reclaimed her life on her own terms. She had built something real, something that no one could take away from her. One afternoon, as she worked in her studio, Yu Xiu walked in, carrying a canvas wrapped in brown paper. "I made this for you," she said, setting it down on the table. Ning carefully unwrapped the canvas, revealing a stunning painting of a phoenix rising from flames. The bird's wings were outstretched, its feathers glowing with vibrant colors that seemed to pulse with energy. "It's beautiful," Ning said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's you," Yu Xiu replied. "The woman who rose from everything meant to destroy her." Ning ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the canvas, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding me of who I've become." As Ning continued to reflect on her journey, she realized that she wanted to do more than just create art. She wanted to use her experiences to help others, people who had been through their own battles, and who were searching for the strength to rebuild their lives. With Yujiu's encouragement, she decided to start a foundation dedicated to empowering women, providing them with resources, mentorship, and opportunities to thrive. The process of launching the foundation was both challenging and rewarding. Ning worked tirelessly, drawing on everything she had learned during her time with Li Xian and Jun Yi. She collaborated with community leaders, secured funding from supportive partners, and built a team of passionate individuals who shared her vision. Throughout it all, Jun Yi remained by her side. Their relationship had grown deeper and more meaningful over time, built on mutual respect and understanding. Jun Yi admired Ning not just for her intelligence and determination, but for her ability to remain compassionate and grounded despite everything she had been through. One evening, as they sat together overlooking the city skyline, Jun Yi turned to Ning. "You've changed so many lives," he said, "including mine." Ning smiled, resting her hand over his. "You've changed mine too," she replied. "In more ways than you know." Their partnership had become more than just professional. It was a source of strength and comfort, a reminder that even the most guarded hearts could find connection and trust again. As the foundation gained momentum, Ning found herself busier than ever. She traveled to different cities, speaking at events, meeting with women who had been inspired by her story, and witnessing firsthand the impact of her efforts. Each success, no matter how small, reaffirmed her belief in the power of resilience and the importance of giving back. But Ning also made sure to take time for herself. She continued to create art, finding solace in the quiet hours spent sketching and painting. She maintained her bond with Yujiu, and their relationship grew stronger with each passing day. And she nurtured her connection with Jun Yi, allowing herself to embrace the love and partnership she had once thought impossible. One evening, as Ning prepared for a speaking engagement, she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the necklace she wore, a simple pendant shaped like a phoenix. It had been a gift from Yujiu, a symbol of everything she had overcome. "You're going to do great," Yujiu said, stepping into the room. "You always do." Ning turned to her sister, smiling warmly. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "You could have," Yujiu replied. "But I'm glad I get to be here with you." As they headed to the event together, Ning felt a sense of calm and clarity. She wasn't nervous about speaking or worried about how she would be received. She knew her story, every painful, beautiful, and transformative part of it, and she was ready to share it with the world. That night, as Ning stood on stage, looking out at the faces of the audience, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "When I was at my lowest, I thought my life was over," she said. "I thought the pain would consume me, that I would never find my way back. But what I've learned is that our scars don't define us, they shape us. They remind us of what we've survived, of the strength we didn't know we had." The room was silent as she continued, her words resonating with the people before her. "We all face moments that test us, moments that break us. But those moments don't have to be the end. They can be the beginning of something new, something better." As the audience rose to their feet in applause, Ning felt a rush of gratitude. She had found her purpose not in forgetting her past, but in embracing it, in using it to create a future filled with hope and possibility. Later that night, as Ning walked home under a canopy of stars, she reflected on how far she had come. She thought of the woman she had been, the one who had cried alone in the darkness, unsure if she would ever feel whole again. And she thought of the woman she had become, strong, fearless, and determined to make a difference. Ningxi was no longer defined by her past. She was a survivor, a creator, and a force of change. And as she looked ahead, she knew one thing for certain: her story was far from over. It was only just beginning.